Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here among the often referenced dream team you've assembled of folks who I've been reading for a long time and sometimes lucky enough to work with. I'm not actually going to speak about New Zealand. It would give me pleasure to do so, having lived in Australia and New Zealand for a year and have had an opportunity to run into both deadly and not deadly things. And it's actually quite a joy to be back home, where you can see in my hometown not so long ago looked quite frosty. And so I use this image today to begin my talk for you, to think about resilience beyond rhetoric. Resilience is something we're hearing a lot about, and for me this is a moment of personal and professional reflection on a 20-year engagement with the subject of complex adaptive systems, and in particular the important aspect of resilience. This image was taken on Christmas Eve in 2013 over the city of Toronto, when a warm storm cell moved in from climates that we don't often see, and through an inversion, temperatures held at about 0 degrees for 36 hours, over which it rained consistently and torrentially. Temperatures then plummeted to minus 25 degrees, where they stayed for 12 days. And this challenged the city's resilience, as you might imagine, in ways that many of us couldn't imagine over the Christmas and New Year's season, having no light, heat, power, water, or food in some cases. And with many people under evacuation orders, then sent to warming shelters. It was a very interesting holiday season, not the most relaxing, I can tell you. But the point is that this really issued a major challenge, not only to our systems of survival, but to our governance systems as well, which have ongoing troubles, as you might know. And this was really about, for me at least, suddenly being very aware that there was absolutely no shortage of rhetoric around the need for resilience. Too little, too late, with not enough critical reflection. And now I have misplaced the magic clicker. It's a wonderful sound effect. It says, move on, please. Well, why resilience and why now? I think there are really several reasons for me that I've been thinking about in the last several years why we might be talking about this a little bit more than in the past. And I see this increasingly as an important synergy between ecology, landscape, and urbanism, the fields at which I work. I was in the interstitial space. And this synergy is powerfully influenced by these several remarkable shifts, I think. And we've heard enough about some of them so that I can skip through them relatively quickly to say that this is really about a shift in urbanism, shifting up scales where we're becoming a planet of cities, mass migration to city regions, the rise of suburbia, exurbia, sprawling megaregions, and so on that we've heard so much about. But for me also, there's an observation that this comes along with a decline in infrastructure, and by that I mean a decline in the quality of infrastructure. We heard Susanna Drake just mention in the previous talk before Tim's that we are facing a time when our infrastructure is crumbling, much of it needs to be replaced as it was built in the same time period. And there's a real opportunity here, both obstacles and opportunities for replacement with different kinds of infrastructure. So this is part of an emerging groundswell of activity. The emergence of ecology, of course, both as a meta-discipline and plural set of disciplines, has much to do with this language, particularly from scientific as well as cultural, political perspectives, coupled with a shift in understanding about what the world we live in is really like in terms of its dynamic complexity. Also, the renaissance of landscape as a discipline over the past 15 to 20 years, I think, must be said, has made some space for movement here, particularly in terms of the agency of design. There really is an opportunity for designers to integrate, facilitate, remediate, and navigate all of these shifts towards a new state. And these synergies offer us some urgency, I think, for innovation and some timely ways to use this knowledge through evidence-based spatial practice. It's something I'm very interested in. We've heard, again, a little bit about that today, and will, no doubt, tomorrow as well. All of these millennial shifts, from my perspective, have really set the ground plane, a ripe moment, if you will, for resilience beyond rhetoric. And I do think that despite 20 years of increasing research and widespread popularization of the paradigm shift in ecology, the new ecology, whatever you'd like to call it, as well as other disciplines undergoing this trend towards systems thinking, all of this resilience is central. Resilience is central to this shift, and yet it's only recently on the rise. And I'll illustrate with an example of why that is. I think you'll all have a version of your own to tell. This is Toronto, October 16th, 1954, a man trying to get clean drinking water from a pump in an odd sort of way. because Hurricane Hazel, a Category 4 hurricane, has just swept over Toronto, and in 1 hour dropped 53 millimeters of rain and set the baseline for our 100-year flood line. That was in 1954. 81 people died, 500 homes were destroyed, all 7 bridges were washed out of the center of the city. So for a small but growing city of under 1 million people, it was nothing short of a catastrophe. But one of the lasting legacies of Hurricane Hazel for the city of Toronto was that our floodplains were protected. The city decided then and there that there would be no more such possibility of catastrophe at this level, and set aside a 200-meter buffer in the downtown core, and in the northern regions set aside stream and valley corridors as protected land. But they did this by calling them hazard lands. It's a new category of zoning for us. And this is what Robert Fulford has referred to as the accidental city. We do have an accidental city. It wasn't brilliantly proactive as much as it grew out of this particular catastrophe. But the accidental city and this act of protecting the green lands gave Toronto its green heart and its blue veins. So we really are now at a point where we can be talking about resilience. We are talking from the realm of policy, politics, and rhetoric. Sometimes we talk from science, sometimes it's nonsense, and sometimes it's just nonsense. And this is a spectrum that we have to navigate rather carefully at the time when the groundswell is swift and rapid in the face of catastrophe. And we've seen a lot of them lately. I think you'll all have, again, your own cities have versions here. I'm going to share Toronto's. It's where I live and work right now. The 8th of June, 2013, this is looking down the main arterial road in Toronto, the Don Valley Parkway. Cars come to a halt at 7 in the morning. This is July the 8th, when 2 storm cells dropped 126 millimeters of rain over Toronto. And just between 4:20 p.m., sorry, not in the morning, in the afternoon, between 4:20 and 6:30, what made things even more difficult was the city had just had 40 millimeters of rain the previous day. And so the storm sewers were overflowing, the grounds were saturated. This is not a condition we typically see on the north shore of the Great Lake where we have gravity on our side. I mean, it's not New Orleans. But about 500,000 people, once again, were affected immediately. 3,000 homes flooded, cost into the millions of billions of dollars at this point. $6.4 billion is estimated over 2 storms that hit. I mean, it's quite shocking. And I guess the comparison here to make is that Hurricane Hazel dropped half that amount of rain, and yet we're still using the same 100-year flood line. So that's a relatively interesting observation 50 plus years later. But 6 weeks earlier in Calgary, in the western part of the country, fast-growing city of 2 million people, this is just under 2 million people. It's Canada's 3rd largest city, and the Bow River flooded, a major river that flows through the Rocky Mountains. It flooded, it runs right through the center of the city. And this is 1,700 cubic meters of water per second flowing in the Bow River Valley, the highest recorded flow since 1897. So that's what we call a 100-year flood for sure. This is six times the normal amount of water volume that would flow through the city. And on this particular Friday, again, this is well over now $2 billion in the first month of insurable costs. So there's a real issue here, not only from the east to the west, but within 6 weeks we're experiencing that kind of flooding. And then I bring you back to the ice storm, just because we haven't had enough catastrophe, December 22nd. This is another view of the insurable damage is quite significant, aside from the personal distress of spending the holidays in the dark when you're meant to be writing papers and so on, and enjoying the holiday with your family. Not that it affects me personally in any way, shape, or form, of course. This is an image from the city yard works, and what's happening here is about 20% of Toronto's mature tree canopy was lost. And we're a very green city, again, the accidentally green city, but this is the urban forestry yard turning our maple trees into compost. Some of them, of course, were there because of the ash borer. But this is a pretty significant loss to the city in terms of reducing our heat island effect in the summer. We now have less to work with. So that green infrastructure loss is a problem for us. So trees were everywhere except standing. They were occasionally poking through your roof, through the window of your car, over top of your car, and of course being given away for free by some kind soul. And a few people found other uses for trees, which I think are just a little humorous, perhaps giving us a little bit of glee at what happened. But all of this is to say, on a more serious note, that these are policy triggers. And we could think very quickly of just 2 in the United States, which are, of course, much bigger in scale, much more serious, more expensive. Everything is bigger in the United States, including the difficulties with these storms, of course. these are taking place in a very, the reaction to them, I think, is interesting to look at in terms of a conversation about resilience. I only pull out several. Of course, there are hundreds, and I'm not familiar with most of them in the way that many of you would be, but I observed this from a distance and seen from some distance away, it seems to me that the Dutch dialogues, the Green Dot Plan, New Orleans' new and nascent water management strategy, but without any governance to put it in place, are all optimistic signs that are in some ways also very reactive and late coming, but good signs that there's a conversation about what can happen to build resilience following a disaster. The Coastal Management Plan is also an interesting study. Some of these, of course, not implemented. In Superstorm Sandy's, the case of Superstorm Sandy in New York, which we've heard a little bit about already today, I realized that Vision 2020 was adopted the year before, but nevertheless it gave a rise for the city to take a hard look at Vision 2020 to understand ways in which the city could be made more storm resistant and adaptable. Of course, Rebuild by Design, the design competition, the HUD program is a very interesting example of thinking about resilience explicitly. Again, not proactively, but at a time that has been triggered by these events. In Canada, I reference only the floods and ice storms. You know, we don't have quite as many dramatic. Actually, we do. To be truthful, we do. We have more frequency and greater magnitude of storm events than ever before in the last 20 years. So says the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. That is actually a policy, I promise you. The Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. They do study these, the costs and frequency and magnitude of storm events, and what we're finding all through these studies right now is that, at least for us, the population density is lower, so the effects may seem lower, but not in terms of our resource management and in terms of the effects spread out over a smaller population. These are all notable triggers for engaging resilience on both political and policy agendas. The case, one comment I would make about the Toronto examples I showed you, the Canadian examples, is that they have resulted in some interesting policy measures that are a little bit more lateral, in part because we do still have the illusion of a welfare state where there is government intervention at multiple scales. And so the green infrastructure plan we have in Toronto, coupled with the Greenbelt Act that's put aside 1.8 million acres of land around the city that it ties into the ravine system, provides an infrastructural possibility for resilience if we were to treat it as a long-term ecological research project. That has not happened, but that's something to consider. We might also think about how we can generalize the notion of resilience. And I would put this is just culled from a very quick policy scan. I did a scan of over 100 policy documents to just determine the language they were using to convey the notion of resilience. I had a brief conversation with Christina Hill at a break, and we were both observing that resilience is really the new sustainability, only it seems to be sustainability with chaos or disaster thrown in. Then you get resilience, or at least you get a willingness to talk about what this means. And the typical language that's used is ability to bounce back or get back to normal. And we'll talk more about what this means from a scientific perspective as it was derived through empirical research in ecological system studies. But here in the policy milieu, it seems to be influenced more by the language of psychology. In fact, it's been quite personalized if you look at some of the language. Resilience documents call upon citizens to have a positive outlook despite challenges, to being adaptable in the face of change. In fact, one of the more interesting documents I found was actually from the Secretary for Management in the Office of Medical Services. This is from the military. The Deployment Stress Management Program has an entire chapter on resilience, which I assume is targeted to people undergoing stress in the military, but nevertheless the language is incredibly similar. Resilience here refers to the ability to successfully adapt to stress, the ability to bounce back from difficult experiences. And it is not a trait that people either have or don't have. It instead is all about attitude and action, and that you can train yourself to have positive actions. So I thought that was a very interesting way to phrase this, rather than using the language of toughing it out and so on. But if we qualify resilience with empirical research from the literature, which we'll do in just a moment, I think we could paraphrase like this to ask a very important question, to say, well, bouncing back is not a justification to return to the status quo that got you into the catastrophic problems you face in the first place. It's a different kind of normal. And this is often lost in the policy translation. We're always talking about bouncing back and getting back to normal. It becomes an excuse for the status quo, much like the critique of sustainability faced the last 20 years. And here we are again with resilience. It is the capacity to absorb a certain amount of stress or disturbance, to reorganize oneself or the system that you're in, and to continue to function in much the same way as before, but not exactly. And therein lies the trick, the policy hook, the challenge, the sticky wicket, if you will. Which normal do we go back to? Is it to Richard Weller's normal Armageddon that we might face, or is it a new state of normal that sees us operating very differently? We could use a number of different analogies you might imagine, but the question really is, how much do you think you can change? This is a question asked by Brian Walker of the CSIRO in Australia, who's done a lot of work on resilience. How much do you think you can change before you become a different person? How much can an ecosystem, a city, or a business change before it looks and functions like a different kind of ecosystem, business, or city? And those are, of course, social, cultural, and political questions. They are not ecological questions. This is an image produced by some students I worked with at Harvard 3 years ago. And I look at this diagram that they produced about sea level, and we might ask the question, what if we considered a range of normal? What if we changed our thinking to move away from a static state of normal and moved instead towards a range, a gradient, the same way we know and understand in landscape architecture and ecology, we understand gradients are very important to consider in our design work. So we also needed policy work to think about gradients. This might serve as a concept for a dynamic measure here in this imaginary concept of a dynamic measure of sea level rather than a single number, whether you're above or below. Imagine what would happen to our systems of government and our behavior if we had more nuanced opportunities for planning and design that considered ranges or gradients. We now can move to unpacking resilience. We've been talking about it for a little bit. We can unpack it. For that, we need to step back a little bit and look at the literature in ecology, where resilience is understood not only to be a heuristic concept, but also an empirically validatable measure. In fact, there are a number of indicators of resilience that have been worked on for the last 20 years. So before we can begin to imagine a resilient world, we have to first establish indicators for what that is. Or, I would argue strongly that we risk losing the knowledge and the research evidence that we've gained in 20 years if we fail to embed both the heuristic and the empirical concepts of resilience in our policies, test them in our designs, and adapt them in our plans. And so to do this, we need to have a quick tour of history, and I've pulled out only several of very many stellar works that I could point to. Howard Odum's work, of course, is central in bringing the language of systems thinking from an empirical perspective into ecology from the late 60s into the early 80s. Picked up then spatially by Richard Foreman, of course, then Michel Gaudron in 1986, and then by our own Fritz Steiner in his work. I'm showing the more recent, the second volume of The Living Landscape, but the earlier volume is, of course, in that same category. All of these texts have to do with the analysis of layers within a system, within layers in the landscape, and also within processes by which ecological planning is undertaken. This is a part of that slow paradigm shift that moves us to a notion of dynamic systems and complex adaptive ecologies. This is really, in my view, where nature is coming into the form of the city, the discussion of the city. The 1980s through the 90s, we start to see the beginning of urban ecology talked about as a social and cultural ecology, as well as that which is out there. The next body of work that I reference is through the 1990s and into the middle part of 2000, the work of C.S. Holland Buzz, a Canadian ecologist who was at one time out working with Carl Walters in fisheries at the University of British Columbia, when they pioneered their theory of complex adaptive ecology that relied on what they call surprising changes that happened in systems that were otherwise described as normal functioning systems. And that work very quickly translated into work that was focused on resource management, which meant by definition it became a social and ecological hybrid system. It wasn't enough just to study ecology outside of humans. This was all focused on understanding resource management. And this is the genesis of the work. So it really never was separate from human systems. And the Frederick work, these are a cohort of really Scandinavians, Canadians, and Minnesotans. That makes a lot of biological sense to you. It does to me from a biome point of view. So the Swedes, the Canadians, and those guys from Minnesota, and they mostly were men. The exception would be Frances Wesley, who's also a Canadian working in social innovation now. And she was at with Henry Mintzberg at the working in the business school at Harvard for quite some time. So there has always been this trajectory of social and cultural decision-making around understanding the concept of resilience. That is to say, working within self-organizing, open, holarchic systems. Which brings us to the summary of that work in 20 years is that we now understand ecosystems, living systems, to be dynamic. And Holland called this a shifting steady state. This is distinct from stability. It challenges our ideas about what stable is. And he doesn't like to use the word stability. In fact, most of the literature no longer does use the term stability because it's confused with a mathematical definition of stability that essentially implies permanence. And stability in an ecological sense is fleeting. Stability in these complex systems is always temporary. It may be very long-lived, longer lived than we are, but it's still temporary. And that is the essence of this definition. So the ecosystem change model is not about stability at all. In fact, we understand them as inherently complex, and this also means that the descriptions of them are also complicated. They don't fit neatly into 2-second sound bites, as you have probably already noticed. In these systems, change is both discontinuous and gradual. You'll notice the prevalence of the word "and" in systems thinking. We're not about binary logic, but about inclusivity, multiple scales of reasoning. Surprise events are normal. This was Holland that coined the term surprise. It was a brilliant move to use the language of the vernacular in terms of resource management, because people need to understand that normal behaviors sometimes are surprising. We don't know when they happen, but we know they will happen. The process of what they also called creative destruction doesn't work well for a flooded basement or a house that's been swept away by a flood. We don't think of that as creative, but of course in the ecological sense, pest outbreak, forest fires, wind throw, and so on are actually creative. They open up opportunities for new niches and so on. In fact, this is what makes those systems, or these characteristics, essential for renewal and resilience of those systems. The hallmark, though, of these is that there are many possible semi-stable states, steady states, many of them, and we don't know which ones are normal. This begs a political question and a design challenge of, well, what's normal? And normal for whom? So the question then for designers always becomes, well, which one do we want? Which one do we want to offer our clients? Do we know enough about the system to empirically guide them in a particular direction? So where we design for diversity, we adapt to change. This is the role of resilience. And this opens up, I think, tremendous windows, and has for some time, for landscape architecture in particular as a profession, and the allied professions of planning and resource management. This is an adapted model of what's come to be known as the Holland four-box or the panarchy figure 8. And what this heuristic or conceptual diagram is showing us is that there's an important role for biodiversity. As a system undergoes stress and strain, multiple ways or pathways for nutrient cycling and the movement of energy through that system are important, and those structures are biodiverse. So we know that the role of biodiversity is important, and it kicks in when a system is undergoing change. We need to be able to spread the shock absorption out through the system, and there has to be multiple opportunities for redundancy. We need more than one of everything. Despite the Noah's Ark story, we know that we need more than one. We do not put our proverbial eggs all in one basket. So the prevalence here of state change is also worth pointing out. I'm going to attempt to use the pointer. I might turn off the computer. Look at that. So up here, what we're demonstrating is that there's an opportunity for the entire system that undergoes this constant state of exploitation, renewal, conservation, and release of energy in this figure 8 pattern. Suddenly it may move into a new state, what's called a regime shift or a state change. And we know that as humans, we like to keep the system in which we work and play to feel normal to us. And that's the bounce back effort. We want to be able to stay within this curve. We don't like moving into some new space where we don't recognize our neighbors and don't recognize the food that is available to us. So in this image, this is work and in a book that I'm working on with Chris Reed that was referenced earlier kindly by Anne Spern. We've worked with some students, in this case, Thomas Holt and others, to try to expand, not complicate necessarily, this idea of the Holland four-box, to show the possibility of multiple scales of operation and multiple states of normal. So this suggests here in this diagram, or is intended to suggest that there are multiple states at any given point within these diagrams, and it helps us to navigate or make visual the question of new states of normal. The other piece of the argument, or the rationale for resilience, is to understand that change takes place at many scales, and it takes place in many in many formats. It can be catastrophic, it can be seasonal, it can be a simple, small disturbance, something at scale of a tree falling in the forest to open up light in the canopy. There are many well-established bifurcations or alterations between two or more states in an ecosystem that might be considered normal if you look at it long enough. Farmers are very good at identifying normal states for their crops, for example. We know if you live on a piece of land a long time, you start to understand what normal perturbations are. When do the storms come? What is the pattern of renewal in the forest in your neighborhood, and so on. Bifurcation or system flips, as they're called in this language, in the Great Lakes are very common in between open water large predator fish and small creatures that live in the mud that no one much cares for. Ecologically, they're all valuable. They're all there. They exist. For us, as resource managers, as fishers, as consumers, as people who play in the lake, we have a strong preference for one of these systems, and that's what makes it, in our world, normal. Another example of flipping or moving between states is, of course, forest fires, and you've probably heard much about this. I just show one example here to illustrate that in a pine oak forest, there's an oscillation depending on the management regime that is applied between one species dominating and a fire-dominated system, depending on whether you let the fires burn or you suppress them. All of this is to say that these are social and ecological systems, as I mentioned before. They're relational. That means to say that we define these ecosystems by our relationship with them, either as resource managers or as planners or designers or homeowners. All of this has for us an imperative in managing the resources that are in place. They're contextual. We can't take a recipe for one ecosystem and move it to another, but we can learn from them. And most importantly, we can learn from the people who live there. We know that in a world of complexity where there's a certain amount of inherent uncertainty and unpredictability, the role of the expert is muted a little bit. And we know that we need to have multiple voices of input to understand at what scale we're working. We also know that the concepts of redundancy and modularity meaning that there are small cycles at scales that are easily or known to be managed using traditional methods. The problems come when we try to scale up to a whole system using the same structure of management that we're used to. We fail to recognize that the entire system is moving. And so we know that in a time of integrated and hybrid systems, we have to think differently about them. An example of changing our management patterns here in Toronto is in the Oak Savanna Park, High Park, which is an oak savanna. We have to burn it to continue to keep the overstory of trees that are considered culturally valuable. They're no more ecologically valuable for any reason that anyone could discern than another tree that provides the same heating, cooling, carbon sequestration, and so on, but they're culturally important. This prairie has always been burned by Native people, but it's not until the last 3 years that the city of Toronto decided to start burning the park. You can imagine how that played out in the media. It was a little bit of a learning curve, I think, for everybody involved. And this is an example where I would say a hybrid state has become normal. The new normal is the non-native. More cultural influences, white-tailed deer who browse out of protected forest, white-tailed deer introduced in this particular instance. There's a cultural question of how to manage for resilience. Do you allow the deer to completely consume that vegetation, or is it culturally worth putting more money in to protect it? So the image that I'm showing you here is an important one that is often lost, and you can imagine a discussion like this, with policymakers, it's challenging to communicate in the context of these multiple scales over time and over space. People want an answer, they want it quickly, they want a simple solution. This is our tradition of decision making. We're not familiar with adaptation and change that is happening at all scales simultaneously or at different rates. And even just conceptually, for us to understand that in this diagram, another one of the Gunderson and Pauling early diagrams, but a very effective one, I think, this is showing time in log time on this scale and space over meters, and at the same time, kilometers and shorter times, those here from minutes all the way up to thousands of years. And what we're showing is that at the scale of a needle, or the crown of a tree, all the way up to the patch and the stand in the forest, there are different time and space effects happening, whether it's fire, budworm, or so on, or whether it is a storm event that is affecting each parts and parcel of that forest right down to the needle. So when we can understand an image like this conceptually, we start to realize that our management regimes have to be much more nuanced. But more importantly, we need just different structures of making decisions if we have to cope with these linked scales So it's not just that we can take one management approach and assume that it will work across all of these levels of an ecosystem's identification. Another way of showing this is to slice the modules at specific scales to show where these little green and the blue balls are. These are different states of an ecosystem. In this case, a lake system, one that has very clear water with lots of bottom vegetation, another one that has too many nutrients and too much algae, and it's operating in that is from a human perspective, and it's operating in a different way. The system can move between one state that is dominated by top vegetation and one that is dominated by the bottom vegetation. The issue here is that our government and management systems usually pick one, and we learn everything about that one. Another way of showing this, again, this is us, the book we just read, we are pushing these diagrams forward to try to make visual and to experiment with the visualization of these movements of living systems. My own book, together with David Walter Taves and the late James Kay, was an attempt to apply some of these principles. In other words, we tried to move from rhetoric to tactic. How do we adopt a series of tactics for intervening in systems? In this case, we were looking at agroecosystems, and we were trying to come up with a set of approaches, a codified approach for particular circumstances, a generalized list of something you could do, not a recipe or a template, but a series of guiding questions that would help people to map out the living system in which they're working. Fritz Steiner's book on Design for a Vulnerable Planet, I think it takes a similar but different approach that is predicated on moving from hazard and disaster into times of opportunity. So in both of these cases, I think we're seeing a move towards approach and tactic. What we can say about resilience at this stage is that we know it's both empirical and conceptual, and that we know we have to be able to think about these systems as having an ability to withstand and absorb some degree of disturbance, but we have to be prepared to accept change effects. In our recovery from these surprises or stresses, and following some perturbation and return to a recognizable state, that's usually our goal is usually to achieve that. Following this perturbation, to move to some state that we recognize. However, getting back to normal can be a wide range. We might do well to assign a series of states in which we want to operate, and to begin to look at design strategies that move us from one to the other. One thing to say, I think importantly on an epistemological level, is that both types of resilience are necessary. Both engineering resilience, which we understand quite well, at least in engineers who work with in a reductionist paradigm, who are interested in how quick something recovers, shock in a material, for example, and ecological resilience, which has a more systemic perspective that has to do with the ability itself of a system to recover. What are the variables required to discuss ability to recover? That's adaptation. That also is inherent resilience. These kinds of resilience are necessary. The important point here is that in the current wave to embrace systems thinking and our rush to jump to a new paradigm, it's very easy, ironically, to fall into a reductionist trap of binary thinking and assume that reductionism or determinism is out and systems thinking is in. But the key characteristic here for systems thinking is that it is inclusive and it works at multiple scales. So by definition then, reductionism is important at certain scales. The good reductionist knowledge we have is simply insufficient to be applied to all levels of an ecosystem or a social cultural system. There are lots of ways to visualize these. We do cover some of this in the book that is coming out shortly on projecting ecology. In this case, I suggest projecting resilience is something we have to be able to understand. This opens up the space for opportunities for designers. If we really want to design for adaptive resilient systems, we have to be able to visualize the conditions necessary and understand what they look like. And there have been some strides towards this. You may have seen this on more than one occasion, a favorite diagram of mine in work with Stoss, in part because we worked with gradients in a flood-adapted system for the Lower Don, a master plan that considered flood adaptation. What would it be like, rather than preventing floods, but to work with rising and changing water levels? What would it be like to structure the buildings around the river rather than structuring the river first? My own students at the University of Toronto are comparing landscape infrastructures in New Orleans and Toronto. In fact, what I've asked them to do, my role as a planner with a group of landscape architects, is to ask them to visualize the policy. This is not a particularly exciting photo collage that shows us an alternate future, but what it does, I think fairly successfully, is analyze in section what policy looks like. What this is analyzing is the wet weather flow master plan in Toronto compared to the water management strategy in New Orleans. And the comparison of these two in sections, the first time I've seen planning officials have to sit down with a group of designers who draw the section of the way in which policy touches the ground. And it becomes immediately clear in one case where you've got gravity working for you, where your opportunities for source intervention are, where you can convey water and where you can hold and store it. It's one thing to write about it in policy, it's another thing to show it. And so this is, I think, a revelatory process to think about in planning where policy for resilience is concerned. Of course, there are compelling and beautiful ways to show multiple phase states, as this student, Christopher Tuccio, has done, a Harvard student visualizing multiple states of milkweed habitat, or in this case, Gino Wirth, another Harvard student. Both of these are moving towards, I think, the concepts of adaptation, design, and experiments. Having the opportunity to do some experiments in design begins with the opportunity, begins with good projection of the possibilities. So the last and short bit of my talk, because I'm suddenly acutely aware that I'm standing between you and the doorway, which means refreshments, I would say that it's important for us to activate resilience. It's not enough to talk about it or unpack it or think about it anymore. We have to activate it. And this, for me, is where the proverbial rubber hits the road. It's the agency of design. And one of the reasons that I have chosen to center my own research and practice at this interstitial space between planning and design. The actions that are necessary, I think, are well known. This is not a technical problem. It's not actually a scientific problem. We have lots of good research, and we've got more than we've ever had before in terms of long-term, robust ecological monitoring data, both urban and not urban. We need more urban data. But it's not really a scientific problem. We know that ecology can serve as a resilient, that is to say the ecological habitats around us can serve as a resilient infrastructure. A little bit resonant with Tim's comment about blue urbanism. My own way to think about it is that land and water are really our green and blue infrastructures. And if we put investments, reinvest in our infrastructure from a green and blue perspective, we link the structures and functions across multiple scales, we have better opportunities for resilience. This means that to a certain extent we're emphasizing connectivity. Sometimes we de-emphasize it if there are opportunities for pathology, but most of the time in urban areas we want to see connected infrastructures for the movement of other species, for example, and for the flow of water and so on. We want diversity, both human diversity, thinking diversity, as well as wildlife diversity, and we want redundancy at multiple scales. We don't put all our eggs in one basket. So all of this means that adaptive capacity and resilience can be, these are the actions we might take. What's interesting, I think, for designers is to think that the agency you have is to illuminate options, to project desirable futures, even if it's through a policy. It doesn't have to be a glamorous drawing, although we all love those. It can be looking at policy in a different way. Making the infrastructure legible, that's another piece that isn't explicit there, but when we rely on empirical evidence for best practices, it means we also have to show what they are. It helps our constituents, our citizens, our users of our projects to be able to read them and understand them. It means we favor contextual and place-based solutions, and it also means we monitor. We've heard a lot of calls for experiments in design and so on, so that we can monitor. For me, the way that I see this is that small is actually beautiful. Many small projects can equal a large one. One large project can have many smaller modules, each of which can be an experiment in place, and when it fails safely. So safe to fail experimentation is usually one of the ways we can move ahead. I will just, instead of showing you more images of Toronto projects with which you're familiar, what I would like to do is just close by asking you, if you're interested in this, to consider the sort of connected infrastructures in Toronto are highlighted in some of these projects in the book that Chris and I have out. And I don't know why it's gray. It's actually a very exciting color of orange, I promise you. But for some reason it's turned out gray. So please have a look and engage us in conversation. We look forward to that. Thank you very much.